Hello and welcome to Silent Echo. There are disappearances that seem built for myth. A hiker enters a forest and does not return. A boat drifts in from open water with no one aboard. A pilot says one strange sentence into a radio and then becomes a rumor that people carry for decades. And then there are the cases that should not be mysterious at all. Cases that happen under electric light. Cases that happen in public. Cases that happen inside places built around movement and records and cameras and schedules. Places where every entrance is controlled. Every gate is numbered. Every passenger is counted. Every minute belongs to a timetable. On the morning of July 8, 2014, a 28-year-old German man named Lars Mittank walked into Varna Airport in Bulgaria. He was supposed to board a flight home. He had been on vacation with friends. He had a passport. He had a ticket. He had spoken to his mother. He had been seen by an airport doctor. He was on camera. Then he stood up from a chair in the terminal, looked around, left his bag behind, ran out of the building, crossed the tarmac side of the airport grounds, climbed a fence, and vanished. That is the entire hook of the case, and it is still difficult to accept in a single breath. A man in an international airport does not simply run out of frame and dissolve. An airport is not wilderness. It is not open sea. It is not a canyon or a national park or a desert basin. It is a place made of systems, security systems, surveillance systems, flight systems, human systems. If someone disappears there, the mind expects a solution to exist somewhere close by. On another camera, in a passenger list, in a taxi record, in a body found just beyond the perimeter, in some ordinary explanation waiting to be matched to the ordinary evidence. But that is not what happened here. What remains is a short stretch of footage that people on the internet have now watched millions of times. A waiting area, a hallway, an abrupt movement, a sprint that does not look theatrical or planned. It looks frightened. It looks urgent. It looks like the last visible seconds of a man reacting to something that made complete sense to him in that moment, and almost no sense to anyone who watched later. There is no grand final statement, no suicide note, no clean criminal narrative, no body, no proven sighting that ended the question, just a modern disappearance, built out of cameras, and still unresolved in spite of them. That is why the Lars Mittank case has lingered for so long. Part of it is the contrast. He disappears in daylight from one of the most controlled kinds of public space a person can occupy. Part of it is the footage itself. Modern mystery cases become more powerful when the audience feels that they are not only hearing about the final moments, but seeing them. A last known frame has a dangerous kind of authority. It makes people believe the answer must be close, because the missing person was close. He is right there. He is moving. He is visible. The event feels less like a vanishing than a puzzle. But visibility is not the same thing as understanding. A camera can give you sequence without meaning. It can show a body moving through space and tell you almost nothing about what the mind inside that body believed was happening. And part of it is that the case sits at the edge of several explanations that each appear plausible for a while and then refuse to hold the whole story together. There was a reported fight during the trip. There was an ear injury. There was a doctor who advised him not to fly immediately. There were calls to his mother that sounded increasingly strange. There was fear. There was confusion. There were reports that he felt he was being followed or targeted. There was a sudden run through the airport, and then nothing that could conclusively explain it afterwards. This is a case that tempts everyone who touches it into pushing one detail too hard. The fight becomes the entire answer, or the injury becomes the entire answer, or medication becomes the entire answer, or mental illness becomes the entire answer, or criminal pursuit becomes the entire answer. But the strength of the case lies in the fact that no single explanation erases the others cleanly. To tell it honestly, you have to resist the internet version of certainty. You have to start with the place. Varna sits on the Bulgarian coast of the Black Sea, a city that in summer becomes a corridor of tourism. Resorts fill with visitors from Germany and elsewhere in Europe. The beaches at Golden Sands draw the kind of holiday energy that feels disposable while you are inside it. Hotels, bars, pools, loud nights, cheap drinks, short trips. The strange temporary intimacy of vacation friendships and routines. This matters because almost every disappearance is haunted by a normal world that existed just before the fracture. Here the normal world was not one of solitude or risk. It was group travel, sun, nightlife. The familiar low-stakes excess of a summer holiday among young men who expected to go home with stories, fatigue, and maybe a mild hangover. Varna Airport itself is a different kind of threshold. Like most airports, it is a place designed around passage rather than presence. People are not supposed to remain there long enough for mystery to settle in. They enter to leave, they wait to move. Airports are emotional accelerators and identity filters. They take the looseness of vacation and convert it back into documents and metal detectors and time zones and departure boards. Anyone who has traveled knows the odd mental shift that happens there. The holiday self begins to dissolve. The practical self returns. Bags are checked. Phones are charged. Medicines are packed. Boarding passes matter more than sunsets. It is one of the reasons the final footage in this case feels so wrong. The airport is where a story like this should begin closing. Instead, it opens. Before we get to that final morning, we need to know who Lars Mittank was, and just as important, who he was not. Public discussion of missing person cases often flattens the missing into two bad categories: innocent symbol or secret danger, the saint or the unstable man with a hidden darkness. Neither is useful here. Lars was a real person at a real stage of life. He was from Germany. He was in his late 20s. Accounts consistently describe him as an ordinary young man on a holiday trip with friends. He was not a celebrity. He was not a drifter with a long public record of mysterious behavior. He was not someone the wider world knew before he vanished. That anonymity matters because it reminds us that for most missing people, the public story only begins at the moment their personal life has already been broken open. What can be said with reasonable confidence is simple. He took a summer trip to Bulgaria with friends. During the trip, something changed. By the time his friends left, he did not leave with them, and by the time he reached the airport alone, he appeared to be frightened in a way that has never been fully explained. Cases like this attract a lot of armchair diagnosis. People who have never met the missing person decide, from a handful of reported behaviors, exactly what was happening inside his mind. One camp insists on a medical or psychiatric episode as if the diagnosis is self-evident. Another insists on pursuit or threat because fear seems too specific to arise from nowhere. A third camp treats every contradiction in press reports as proof of conspiracy. That is the first weak spot in the Lars Mittank case, and it has to be stated clearly. Much of what the public thinks it knows comes through media summaries, translated interviews, secondary retellings, and internet repetition. Some core elements are well established. The airport footage is real. His disappearance is real. The broad holiday timeline is real. But many of the smaller details around medications, exact statements, exact injuries, and exact movements before the airport have passed through enough retelling that they should be handled carefully. That does not weaken the mystery. It protects it from becoming folklore. The reported timeline before the airport usually begins with the holiday itself. Lars traveled to Golden Sands with a group of friends. It was an ordinary vacation setting, and by most accounts there was nothing remarkable about the early days. Then came the incident that many people now treat as the hinge of the entire case. According to repeated reports, Lars became involved in some kind of dispute or altercation, often said to be related to football club loyalties and a confrontation with other men. The exact shape of that incident varies across tellings. Some accounts frame it as a bar fight. Others suggest a confrontation outside, but the general claim is that he suffered an ear injury, often described as a ruptured or perforated eardrum, after being struck or involved in violence. That detail matters because it is one of the few points where physical injury enters the narrative before the final airport footage. It may help explain why he did not fly home with his friends as planned. Reports commonly state that a doctor advised him not to fly immediately because of the ear injury. Air pressure changes can worsen certain ear conditions, especially if the eardrum is damaged. If that advice was given, it would have turned a group departure into a solitary delay. His friends left. Lars remained behind for a short period, planning to take a later flight. And right there, the story begins to narrow. Group travel provides witnesses, emotional grounding, and social correction. People notice when you are acting strangely. They talk you down. They reframe your fear. They share taxis and hotel lobbies, and the ordinary friction that prevents a person from disappearing into his own escalating thoughts. Solitude removes that buffer very quickly. If Lars was already injured, stressed, embarrassed by the fight, worried about complications, or frightened for reasons that made sense to him, being left alone in a foreign holiday environment may have sharpened everything. This is not an argument for any single theory. It is simply the kind of human change that matters in the final day of many cases. The world does not have to become more dangerous for a person to feel that it has. Isolation can do a great deal of work all by itself. Reportedly, he moved from the hotel where he had been staying with his friends to another cheaper hotel closer to the airport. This detail appears in many versions of the case, and it fits the practical logic of someone waiting out a brief delay before a flight home. But even within the practical, people noticed a shift. There are reports that he seemed afraid, reports that he believed men were looking for him, reports that he told his mother things that sounded increasingly unusual. Some accounts say he was worried about being robbed or killed. Some say he thought certain people were connected to the airport or trying to get to him through the hotel. The exact wording changes depending on the source. The broader impression does not. In the final phase before his disappearance, Lars appears to have believed that some threat was real and close. Now the obvious question begins to press on the case. Was it real? That question is the center of everything, and almost every theory is an attempt to answer it with more certainty than the evidence allows. If the threat was real, then someone frightened him enough during the holiday or after it to send him into a state of escalating fear that culminated at the airport. If the threat was not real in the objective sense, then his fear may have come from injury, medication, stress, exhaustion, a psychiatric break, substance use, or some combination that altered his perception. The problem is that both possibilities can produce the same observable behavior. A person who is truly being pursued and a person who only believes he is being pursued can both look terrified. A camera cannot tell the difference. Before the airport morning, there is also the matter of the call to his mother. This has become one of the most repeated parts of the case and also one of the parts most vulnerable to dramatic overstatement. The broad story is consistent. Lars called his mother in Germany while he was still in Bulgaria. He told her he felt unsafe. He said things that later suggested fear and urgency. One phrase is often quoted in translations as something like, "I do not want to die here," or a closely related expression of dread. Some reports also say he asked her to block his credit card. Some say he mentioned men following him. Some say his voice sounded frightened and unlike himself. These details are emotionally powerful because they transform the case from a silent disappearance into one with a partial voice. The audience hears not only what he did, but what he may have felt. But here again, caution matters. We are dealing with reported recollection and translated media retellings, not a full official transcript released in a clean documentary package. The essence is clear enough. His mother believed he was scared. He was trying to get home. Something had gone wrong in the final day of the trip. But the exact phrasing of every line should not be treated as sacred evidence when it may have passed through multiple layers of retelling. That is one of the reasons this case stays so open. The final hours exist in a fog of partial certainty. Some things are hard, He was on camera at the airport. He ran. He vanished. Other things are soft. Why he was scared. What exactly had happened in the alleged fight. How much his injury mattered. What medications he took and how they affected him. Whether anyone was truly after him. Whether the fear belonged to the outside world or the inside one. All of the most decisive questions live in the soft zone, and then the camera turns on. The footage from Varna Airport is one of those modern pieces of evidence that is both clarifying and destructive. Clarifying because it gives sequence. Destructive because it seduces the mind into believing that sequence is enough. You can watch it and still be left with more uncertainty than before. In the footage, Lars appears in the airport terminal. He is carrying belongings. He is waiting. He enters an airport medical office or consultation room. This is another important point in the timeline. He was seen by an airport doctor before boarding. The public explanation usually links this to the earlier ear injury and the question of whether he was fit to fly. What happened in that room has become one of the most crucial and disputed pieces of the story. Some reports suggest the doctor examined him and found no reason he could not travel. Some versions imply that while in or near the office, Lars heard or noticed something that triggered immediate panic. There are claims that a construction worker or another person entered nearby and that Lars reacted as if the man posed a threat. But again, the public record is patchy. We do not have a universally accepted, fully detailed, official narrative of every second in that room. What we do have is what happened next. He gets up quickly. He leaves his possessions behind. He runs. Not with the confusion of someone who forgot something at check-in. Not with the casual hurry of a late passenger who hears a boarding call. He runs with a full-body urgency that feels instinctive through the terminal, out a door, across an outside section of the airport grounds, past the organized geometry of travel and into open space. At some point, he climbs or crosses a fence. Then he disappears beyond the perimeter, toward a field or wooded area, depending on how the location is described in different reports. And he is never conclusively documented again. It is one of the most unsettling final movements in any missing person case, because it looks like a choice, and not a choice at the same time. He is obviously acting. He is not being dragged. No one on the footage appears to tackle him or force him out of the building. Yet the movement does not look free. It looks compelled by whatever he believed in that moment. That is why the footage has such a strong psychological grip on viewers. It presents agency that feels almost indistinguishable from desperation. He is moving himself out of sight, but he does not look like a man calmly choosing a new life. He looks like a man trying to get away from something. The terminal itself matters here. Airports are threshold spaces, and threshold spaces can sharpen mental states. People move from controlled interior environments to exposed exterior ones very quickly. Doors open. Noise changes. The body senses pursuit or exposure differently in a place designed around open lines of movement. If Lars was already frightened, the airport could have amplified it. Every stranger might have looked meaningful. Every employee might have seemed connected. Every delay might have felt dangerous. Again, this does not tell us whether the fear was justified in an external sense. It tells us that the setting was perfectly built to convert fear into motion. Once he leaves the airport grounds, the case undergoes a transformation that many modern disappearances share. For a few minutes, it feels urban and solvable. Then suddenly, it becomes environmental. The airport sits near areas that are not city center streets, lined with endless cameras. Beyond the fence, there are roads, vegetation, open ground, industrial margins, fields, patches of cover. A person can move out of a surveillance environment and into a much looser one very fast. That transition is where so many people misread the case. They think airport means impossible disappearance. But Lars was not last seen in the middle of passport control, surrounded by 20 cameras. He was last seen leaving the structured system and entering the unstructured edge beyond it. Once that happens, the mystery changes shape. It is no longer how can someone vanish in an airport. It becomes How far can someone go after leaving one in a state of extreme fear or confusion before the world stops recording him? The first search and response should have closed some of that gap. Instead, it preserved it. Once Lars failed to return and concern rose, authorities searched the area around the airport. Reports commonly say that the region around the airport and nearby terrain were examined. There were appeals. There were checks of hospitals and shelters and possible leads. But a search after a disappearance is always only as strong as its timeline. Every hour matters. A person leaving a terminal on foot in a panic can cover distance surprisingly quickly, especially if he is not thinking in rational route patterns. He might hide. He might head for water. He might accept a ride. He might collapse in vegetation just beyond where anyone expects. He might reach another road and become detached from the airport story entirely. The fact that the search did not produce him quickly does not automatically support one theory over another. It only tells us that once he crossed the fence, the controlled world had already failed to contain the event. This is where the atmosphere of the place becomes part of the case. The Black Sea resort coast in midsummer is a strange backdrop for disappearance. It is not a bleak winter borderland. It is not an empty steppe. It is a season of tourists and sun and bright mornings. But edges of holiday zones can feel more unsettling than wilderness because they are built on illusion. The center is crowded, the edge is loose. Behind the resort bars and beaches are service roads, scrub, unfinished spaces, transportation corridors, and the kind of margins people never remember clearly after they have passed through them. A man running from an airport does not vanish into a fairy tale landscape. He vanishes into the unloved spaces around normal life. Those places can hide a body or a witness or a route more effectively than people expect because nobody builds stories around them until later. So who was Lars in those final hours? A careful answer has to leave room for several possibilities. He may have been frightened because of a real conflict that had begun during the trip and was still active. He may have been frightened because injury, stress, lack of sleep, alcohol, medication, or another factor had altered his judgment. He may have been frightened because of both at once. That third option is often ignored, and it may be the most realistic. Real life does not always separate objective danger from subjective vulnerability. A person can be assaulted or threatened and then become more mentally unstable because of the experience. A person can be mildly injured and then spiral into fear that goes far beyond the original event. A person can also be living with a vulnerability that becomes visible only under travel stress. None of those possibilities are mutually exclusive, and that is why the case is still unresolved in any satisfying sense. Because even if you believe you know why he ran, you still have to explain what happened after the run. Let us stay with the final normal hours before that fracture. There is a human tendency to reconstruct all last days as ominous once the ending is known, but the last normal hours of a disappearance are often patchworks of the ordinary. Hotel rooms, phone calls, a taxi, sitting in a waiting area, asking practical questions about a flight, one more visit to a doctor, a bag set down on a chair. These small acts are devastating later because they are so modest. They are evidence not of someone already gone, but of someone still engaged with the world. Lars was still trying to move through ordinary systems, still using airports and telephones and hotel beds and medical advice. He had not stepped out of reality. Reality had simply begun to misfire around him or inside him. Accounts of his behavior in the final phase often emphasize paranoia. It is a heavy word, and people use it too quickly. In everyday speech, it becomes shorthand for fear that others dismiss. In clinical language, it implies a set of possibilities that cannot be responsibly diagnosed by strangers over the internet. The better way to approach it is narrower and more documentary. Lars appears to have believed he was in danger. That belief seems to have intensified rather than eased. His actions at the airport are consistent with fear. Whether that fear reflected an actual pursuit a distorted perception, or a combination of both remains unknown. This phrasing is less dramatic than the internet version, but it is more honest and better suited to the evidence. There is another reason to be careful here. Missing person cases can become cruel very quickly when mental state is discussed. Families hear the public turn their loved one into a diagnosis. Viewers begin to speak as if fear makes someone less real or less worthy of urgent inquiry. But fear is not a solved category. If Lars suffered a mental health crisis, that does not erase the mystery of why it happened there and what happened after. If he did not, then reducing him to paranoia may bury whatever external factor actually frightened him. Either way, glib certainty helps no one. What can be examined is the fracture point itself. Imagine the airport doctor office, perhaps a bright institutional room, fluorescent light, paperwork, a body already tired from travel and stress. If Lars was there to determine whether he could fly, then psychologically the stakes were high. A positive answer meant escape and return home. A negative one meant more delay in the very place where he no longer felt safe. Delay can be intolerable when a person believes danger is nearby. And somewhere in that small environment something happens. A sound, a phrase, a person entering, a look through a window, a change in internal pressure that the camera cannot capture. And then he is moving at full speed. That gap between stimulus and action is where people pour all their theories. Some insist he heard the names of men who had threatened him. Some say he saw a worker enter and misread the situation. Some think he simply tipped into panic at the moment he learned he could not board or feared that he could not. Some believe a medication reaction or sleep deprivation made the room itself intolerable. None of these are impossible. None are proven in the way internet confidence often pretends. If you slow the footage down mentally, what makes it so haunting is not only the run, it is the abandonment. He leaves his bag. A man planning a careful escape usually takes the things he needs. A man fleeing immediate danger may not. This is one of the strongest arguments against elaborate disappearance theories. The run does not look prepared. It looks impulsive and urgent. It looks like someone crossing from thought into action faster than ordinary planning can keep up. His belongings become evidence of that transition. They remain behind like the outer shell of a normal trip, while the person who owned them exits the script. Once outside the terminal, he runs across an area that ought to have made the next step easier to solve. Yet, this is where another weakness in the case appears. Public understanding of the immediate pursuit and search is much thinner than many viewers assume. We know the footage, we know the broad direction of his movement, but most people who discuss the case cannot actually describe with precision how quickly he was followed, what blind spots existed, what later camera coverage did or did not capture, how comprehensively nearby roads were checked in the first crucial window, or how far he could have traveled before the search truly focused. Those procedural details matter more than sensational theories. Missing person cases often survive not because something impossible happened, but because the first response contained just enough uncertainty for multiple futures to remain open. One future is that he kept moving under his own power for a substantial distance. This is more plausible than it sounds. People in states of panic, fear, or altered judgment can cover ground, ignore injury, and enter landscapes they would never choose in a calm state. If Lars believed he had seconds rather than minutes, he may have prioritized concealment over orientation. He may have left obvious routes. He may have hidden when searchers were near. He may have avoided help because he no longer trusted strangers. This is one reason cases involving fear are so difficult. The missing person may act against rescue precisely when rescue becomes possible. Another future is that he encountered someone after leaving the airport. This is the path that keeps suspicion alive. A frightened man alone, moving erratically through the margins around an airport, is vulnerable in multiple ways. He may accept a ride from the wrong person. He may encounter someone opportunistic. He may collide with the very people he thought he was escaping. whether or not they truly existed in the form he imagined. But like many foul play theories, this one has emotional force without a strong public evidence chain. There is no widely accepted proof that someone intercepted him immediately after the fence. There is only the fact that after the camera lost him, the world did too. And then there is the darkest ordinary possibility. He ran, hid, became exhausted, disoriented, or injured, and died in terrain that searchers somehow missed. This explanation often disappoints people because it lacks villainy. It also collides with the public feeling that the area around an airport is too developed for a body to remain hidden indefinitely. But hidden remains in semi-urban and edge environments are not unheard of. Vegetation, drainage areas, construction margins, abandoned structures, industrial lots, and fragmented land use can conceal a person for far longer than intuition allows. The weakness of this theory is not that it is impossible. It is that the search should have found something if he remained near the airport. Yet searches are not omniscient. They are time-bound and terrain-bound and only as accurate as the assumptions guiding them. There are reported later clues that have kept the case alive in a more unstable way. There were suggestions that his mobile phone was used, or at least active for some period after the disappearance. Some sources mention a signal or contact in the general region. Others point to unverified sightings in different places, and even other countries. Over the years, one of the most famous supposed sightings placed him far from Bulgaria, in another continent entirely. But these claims demonstrate another important rule of unresolved cases. The longer a disappearance remains open, the more it begins to manufacture ghosts. Human beings see the missing everywhere. A man with a beard in a train station, a face in a grainy photo, a hotel employee in another country, a drifter who resembles the old image. Such leads may be sincerely reported. They are still not the same thing as evidence. If we are honest, the case has two separate engines. One is the actual disappearance. The other is the internet life of the disappearance. Those engines do not always move at the same speed. The internet version of Lars Mittank is a man frozen forever in a sprint, a face in airport footage, a ready-made symbol for modern vanishing. The real case is slower and more frustrating. It is a tangle of travel records, second-hand statements, partial media histories, uncertain medical context, and a final movement that may be easy to watch but not easy to interpret. That is why this script cannot be built only around the footage. The footage is the fracture. It is not the whole architecture. To understand why this case endures, you have to sit with the human timeline that led to it: a group vacation, a conflict, an injury, separation from friends, a hotel change, calls home, fear growing in a foreign environment, a final attempt to leave, a medical consultation, then a break from the ordinary path so abrupt that everyone watching later assumes the answer must be coded inside that exact second. But perhaps the answer lies in the accumulation before it, not what happened when he stood up from the chair, but everything that made standing up feel like survival. This is where the place becomes active again. Tourist zones often create a false sense of permeability. You think you understand them because you understand the brochure version. A beach resort seems legible. Airport transfer roads seem legible. But legibility collapses quickly when you are alone, hurt, and frightened. A person can move from the bright logic of a package holiday to the dark logic of local uncertainty in one night. Suddenly, the cheap hotel is not just practical. It is isolating. The taxi driver is not just a driver. He is a possible threat or witness. The nearby men speaking a language you do not understand become impossible to place. None of this proves danger. It proves how easily travel strips a person of context. When fear enters that environment, context does not return. It erodes. There is also the vulnerability of injury. Ear trauma may sound minor to people who have not experienced it, but head and ear injuries can create pain, dizziness, pressure changes, disorientation, sleep disruption, and a heightened sense of bodily instability. Add alcohol from a holiday environment, inconsistent rest, possible medication, and stress, and the body becomes a much less reliable anchor. Again, this is not enough to diagnose or conclude. It is enough to say that the final day of Lars's trip was not a normal departure day. He was already carrying a destabilized body into an unstable state of mind. Some reports mention an antibiotic or other medication prescribed after the injury. The internet often jumps from that fact to dramatic claims of rare psychiatric side effects. This is another area where discipline matters. Certain medications can contribute to confusion or distress in some individuals. So can alcohol, dehydration, sleep deprivation, pain, and stress. But turning one reported prescription into a complete explanation goes beyond the public evidence. At best, medication is one possible contributing factor in a larger picture, not a proven key that unlocks everything. When people debate whether the case is more likely criminal or psychological, they often miss a third category that disappearance cases repeatedly reveal. The third category is situational collapse. A person becomes caught in a narrowing loop between external circumstances and internal response. Maybe there was a real altercation. Maybe he did feel watched afterward. Maybe the ear injury made him feel physically wrong. Maybe separation from friends removed the social check. Maybe the call to his mother reinforced the feeling that escape had to happen now. Maybe the airport doctor visit became the final intolerable delay. At that point, the distinction between external threat and internal panic becomes less important than the fact that the person is no longer making ordinary decisions. Situational collapse produces behavior that can look incomprehensible from the outside and completely necessary from the inside. The first search and immediate aftermath should have answered one question at least. Was he somewhere close? That it did not is one reason this case became so sticky. If Lars had been found injured in nearby brush, the story would have closed into tragedy. If he had been found dead near the airport, the mystery would have narrowed into mechanism. If he had used his passport and bank cards elsewhere, the story would have become a pursuit. Instead, the aftermath remained incomplete enough to preserve every theory in reduced form. Not proven, not impossible, just alive. Public fascination also feeds on a contradiction at the center of the footage. Lars does not look like a man trying to disappear permanently. He looks like a man trying to escape something immediate. Those are different energies. Planned disappearances usually need time, resources, calm, and preparation. Panic flights usually destroy those things. He left possessions. He ran into uncertainty. He did not move like someone beginning a clean new life. This is one of the strongest reasons the voluntary disappearance theory remains weak for many observers. It requires us to treat the most chaotic visible part of the case as deliberate cover for a long-term plan, and the footage resists that reading. Yet voluntary disappearance never fully dies as a theory because there is no body, no confirmed fatal scene, no conclusive criminal event. The mind hates that void. It would rather imagine agency than waste. But again, a real documentary has to be honest about what the visible evidence supports. The footage supports fear far more strongly than it supports strategy. There is also the question of why no one has found him if he simply ran off in distress. This is the most powerful challenge to the accidental death or collapse theory, and it deserves real attention. The area around the airport is not a vast mountain range. It is not the open Arctic. Over time, development and activity should have increased the chance of discovery. Yet no confirmed remains surfaced publicly in a way that resolved the case. That absence keeps the field open for foul play and long-distance movement theories. But absence alone is still not enough to prove them. Human remains can remain hidden unexpectedly close to civilization, especially in fragmented terrain that nobody searches with perfect assumptions. If he reached another transport route or accepted help from strangers, the body might not even be near the airport at all. The fact that he was not found nearby does not tell us where he went. It only tells us that the first model of where to look may have been incomplete. As the years passed, The case acquired the strange afterlife that all unresolved modern disappearances do. It became a recurring internet ritual. New viewers discovered the CCTV and reacted with the same disbelief. People built elaborate frame-by-frame analyses. Others claimed the explanation was obvious and everyone else was blind. Some focused on the alleged fight as proof of criminal pursuit. Others focused on the airport doctor episode as proof of psychological collapse. The case became less a missing person file than a psychological mirror. People saw in Lars what they already feared. State surveillance that still misses everything. The fragility of the mind under stress. The danger of being alone abroad. The possibility of organized violence hidden inside tourist zones. The terror of running from something no one else can see. That internet life gives the case reach. It can also damage proportion. A person is lost. A family remains without closure. The final footage is not an entertainment object, even if it circulates like one. And the more a case becomes famous for a clip, the greater the risk that the clip replaces the person. We remember the run and forget the ordinary days that made it meaningful. The holiday. The mother on the phone, the friendships, the practical plan to return home, the body with an injured ear still trying to move through a routine departure. Mystery is powerful because it freezes a person at the point where the answer should have appeared. Humanity returns only when we rewind. So let us rewind. A young man travels for summer holiday. He and his friends drink and move through the easy temporary life of a resort. Something goes wrong. Perhaps violence, perhaps fear, perhaps both. He gets hurt. The group plan fractures. His friends leave. He stays behind. He tries to navigate doctors and hotel rooms and foreign uncertainty alone. He tells his mother he is afraid. He goes to the airport to finally leave. Then in a place where he should have been safest because he was nearest to return, something inside his world breaks open, and he runs in the opposite direction from home. That is the emotional structure of the case, and it is what makes it so haunting. The airport is not simply the last place he is seen. It is the place where rescue from the situation should have become possible. He had almost made it back into the normal world, and that may be precisely what made the final break so violent. The closer he came to escape, the less able he may have been to tolerate anything that seemed to delay it. There is another subtle detail in the footage and in the public reaction to it. Lars is not wandering. He is accelerating. That matters because wandering suggests drift and confusion over time. Acceleration suggests trigger. Something happened or seemed to happen that converted tension into immediate movement. Theories that depend on slow planning or a calm decision to vanish are forced to fight against the energy of the footage. Theories that involve immediate fear fit the visible behavior more naturally, whether that fear arose from a real threat, a perceived one, or both. From here, the case enters the phase where evidence is thinner and interpretation becomes dangerous. The right way to proceed is not to stop reasoning. It is to separate layers. Layer 1 is confirmed visible action. Lars was at the airport. He saw the doctor. He ran. He left the grounds. He was not conclusively seen again. Layer 2 is reported context that appears in multiple accounts, but still carries some uncertainty. There was an earlier altercation. There was an ear injury. He did not fly home with friends as planned. He called his mother in distress. He seemed fearful. Layer 3 is later theory and public reconstruction, medication side effects, pursuit by criminal men, psychosis, secret disappearance, later sightings abroad, exploitation by traffickers, death near the airport. Each may contain a grain of possibility. None can be handled as proven truth without stronger evidence than the public record offers. Theories and their limits are where many mystery documentaries either become honest or collapse into theater. So let us take them one by one. The strongest practical theory is that Lars suffered a psychological crisis in the final phase of the trip, whether triggered by injury, stress, sleep loss, substances, medication, pre-existing vulnerability, or a combination, and that this crisis made him flee the airport in genuine terror. After leaving the airport grounds, he may have hidden, wandered, become injured, encountered hazardous terrain, or moved unpredictably until he died or became impossible to trace. What does this explain well? It explains the panic in the footage. It explains the abandonment of belongings. It explains the reports of fear and strange calls to his mother. It explains why he ran from a place of safety rather than toward organized help. It explains why no coherent criminal narrative has emerged publicly with names, arrests, or firm motive. What does it fail to explain well? It does not explain with certainty why no remains were found or identified in a way that resolved the case publicly. It also risks oversimplifying the original conflict during the trip, if that conflict was more serious than later skeptics assume. The second major theory is that the threat was real in a concrete external sense. He had been assaulted or threatened during the holiday and believed the same people or their associates remained nearby. His fear at the airport was therefore not a symptom, but a response. He ran because he recognized someone or heard something that convinced him the danger had caught up with him. After leaving the airport, he may have been intercepted, forced into a vehicle, or otherwise prevented from returning. What does this explain well? It explains why his fear sounded specific, and why he may have spoken to his mother as if he was in real danger from identifiable men. It explains the trigger-like quality of the airport run. It also explains why he may have avoided uniformed staff or strangers if he believed the threat network was wider than a single fight. What does it fail to explain well? It lacks a clear, publicly proven chain. No widely accepted suspects emerged. No confirmed camera sequence shows pursuit. No verified physical evidence publicly ties known attackers to the disappearance after the airport. The theory is possible. It is not established. A third theory often raised is that a medication reaction or other physiological factor played a primary role. Depending on the specific medicine prescribed, and depending on his state of health, dehydration, alcohol intake, and sleep loss, the argument goes he may have become acutely disoriented or paranoid. What does this explain well? It provides a mechanism for sudden fear and altered judgment in a short window. It also fits the broader reality that travel stress and physical injury can interact badly with medication in some individuals. What does it fail to explain well? Public reporting on exactly what he took and how it affected him is not strong enough to turn this into a confident explanation. Medication may be part of the picture. It is thin as the entire picture. Then there is the voluntary disappearance theory. Lars used the airport footage as a dramatic exit, abandoned his old life, and began another one elsewhere. What does this explain well? It explains the lack of remains and accommodates the unverified sightings that accumulated later. It also appeals to the human preference for agency over tragedy. What does it fail to explain well? Almost everything visible. The footage looks reactive, not strategic. He leaves behind belongings. He appears frightened rather than composed. There is no broadly convincing public evidence of financial activity, new identity use, or a stable post-disappearance life. This theory survives mostly because no other theory has closed the case completely. Another possibility, quieter but important, is that he ran in fear and then accepted or sought help from the wrong person. In other words, the original fear may have been internal or partially justified, but the final fatal event could have been opportunistic foul play, unrelated to the men he feared. A vulnerable foreign tourist moving erratically near an airport edge is exposed. Someone offering a ride might appear as rescue in the moment. What does this explain well? It preserves the authenticity of his fear without requiring the entire threat map in his mind to be accurate. It also offers a route by which he could vanish quickly from the immediate search area. What does it fail to explain well? Again, the absence of a public evidence chain, no known vehicle, no confirmed witness, no body. It is plausible because it fits general risk, not because it is positively established. Cases like this also create a temptation to overvalue later sightings. a photograph from another country, a drifter in a city street, someone who resembles him years later. The public loves these because they reopen time. They suggest that the missing person did not end at the last known moment, but continued somewhere out there, older and detached from the first story. Yet resemblance is not identity, and the farther a case travels through the internet, the more it seeds false recognition. The Lars Mittank case became globally familiar enough that any vaguely similar face in another country could be recruited into the narrative. That does not mean every sighting is worthless. It means none should outweigh the stronger architecture of the known timeline without very good evidence. One of the most important weak spots in public discussion is that people often confuse unanswered with inexplicable. The case is unanswered. That is true. But parts of it remain quite explicable. A young man abroad is injured, frightened, isolated, and behaving in a progressively unstable way before vanishing. That does not require the supernatural or a hidden global conspiracy. The inexplicable part is not why a human being could enter crisis. The inexplicable part is why no later evidence resolved the outcome. Those are different questions. The first belongs to psychology, environment, and stress. The second belongs to search failure, chance, and the brutal fact that a person can still be lost even in the modern world. There is another reason the case disturbs people. It attacks a modern faith. We believe cameras should save us from true uncertainty. We believe surveillance has made certain kinds of disappearance obsolete. Not impossible, perhaps, but at least measurable, traceable, solvable. The Lars Mittank case exposes the weakness in that faith. Cameras are strongest at edges of systems. They show you who passes through the gate. They do not control what happens after a person leaves the gate in a state no one fully understood. The footage gives us confidence right up until it fails us. That is why the last sprint feels so much more haunting than a final phone call from a remote place. We think we are seeing the answer begin. In reality, we are seeing the last point where the system still sees him at all. And systems matter, because the airport is not the only one that failed. There is also the tourism system, the social system, the medical system, the family communication system. No single failure caused the disappearance, but each may have left Lars more exposed. A group holiday became a solitary delay. An injury became a destabilizing factor. Fear, whatever its cause, did not meet a response strong enough to keep him anchored. Airports are excellent at processing passengers. They are not built to hold a frightened human being together. When people say the case feels like a nightmare, this is what they mean. Not that the footage is surreal, though it is. Not that the theories are bizarre, though some are. They mean that the ordinary path out of danger reversed itself. Home was on the other side of the gate. Instead, he ran away from the gate. That inversion gives the case its emotional permanence. We can all understand missing a flight. We can all understand being stressed abroad. We can all understand wanting to get home. Very few of us can understand why, at the threshold of home, a person would run in the opposite direction, unless something had already gone terribly wrong. The enduring question of this case is therefore not only, where did Lars go? It is, what world was he inhabiting in those last minutes? Was it a world where real men were closing in on him? Was it a world altered by fear and injury until danger appeared everywhere? Was it a world in which both things were true at once? The footage can never answer that because cameras record position, not meaning. Meaning lives in the gap between what the person believes and what the world confirms. Lars crossed that gap in full view, and still took the reason with him. Cases like this also force an uncomfortable humility about search and evidence. We like to think that if the initial event is recorded, the ending will be close behind. But the real world is not a closed-circuit narrative. A person can flee from a camera into bad luck, into terrain, into a stranger's vehicle, into water, into a building no one checks, into a psychiatric collapse, into a road accident that is never matched back to the original identity, or into death in a place no one would ever think to connect. The modern world is traceable in theory and full of blind space in practice. Lars Mittank vanished in that contradiction. For his family, all of this abstraction collapses into something much simpler and more brutal. A son and friend left for a holiday and did not come back. There is no confirmed grave, no final certainty, just a last image repeated publicly for years. One of the cruelest features of famous missing person cases is that the family does not get a private final memory. The world begins sharing it, analyzing it, slowing it down, turning it into content. And yet, without that footage, the case might have gone cold in another way. It is evidence and wound at the same time. The airport footage also creates a false feeling that we are close to Lars himself. But proximity to the image is not proximity to the mind. The truth is that we do not know what he thought as he ran. We do not know if he expected to hide for minutes or hours. We do not know if he believed someone was directly behind him. We do not know if he thought he would return to the terminal from another angle or avoid it forever. We do not know whether the outside air calmed him or deepened the fear. We do not know whether he regretted the run immediately. All we know is that something in that room or in him or in the world he thought he was seeing turned the straight line home into a route out of sight. If there is a lesson in the case, it is not a simple safety slogan. It is not just to not travel alone or trust your instincts or seek help. Those lessons may matter, but they are too neat for what happened. The deeper lesson is that disappearance often begins before a person goes missing. It begins when their relationship to the world stops matching everyone else's. When fear becomes private knowledge. When help is close but no longer feels trustworthy. When the body is still visible and the person inside it is already moving beyond ordinary reach. By the time Lars ran through Varna Airport, he may already have been disappearing in that sense for hours. This is also why attempts to turn the case into a pure crime story or a pure mental health story both feel incomplete. Human crises are rarely that clean. The world presses in. The mind answers. Injury reshapes feeling. Isolation amplifies it. One real threat can generate 10 imagined ones. One imagined threat can push a person into a real fatal situation. The boundary between external and internal danger is not always where we want it to be. The Lars Mittank case sits exactly on that boundary and refuses to choose for us. The final movement across the airport grounds is almost cinematic in its clarity. A man runs, a fence. Beyond it, uncertainty. But the real horror lies in what is not cinematic at all. A hotel transfer, a delayed flight, an injured ear, a call to a mother, a consultation room. The small bureaucratic and bodily facts that make up ordinary life. Mystery grows stronger when it erupts from those facts instead of replacing them. That is why this case still feels modern and intimate. No mountain swallowed him. No storm erased him. He was moving through checklists and waiting areas and summer travel, the most banal machinery of contemporary life, and still found a way to disappear. Many disappearances become larger than the missing person because they let culture tell stories about itself. The Lars Mittank case tells a story about surveillance and its limits, about travel and dislocation, about how quickly a person can become vulnerable when a group becomes an individual, about fear that may be justified and fear that may not, and the impossibility of distinguishing them from the outside in real time. But underneath all of that is the oldest missing person truth of all. A real human life reached a point where the next step could not be witnessed clearly enough to preserve it. As long as that remains true, the case will continue to return. People will keep watching the clip because it compresses a modern nightmare into seconds. Not wilderness, not darkness, not a forgotten era, an airport in daylight. A man who should have boarded a plane and gone home. That is what gives the story its lasting weight. It is not that he vanished from a place where disappearance is common. It is that he vanished from a place designed to prevent the world from losing track of people. And yet, it did. Perhaps the most honest ending is also the least satisfying. Lars Mittank was almost certainly not swallowed by anything supernatural or impossibly hidden architecture. He was a human being under extreme strain, moving through a final sequence of fear that was visible but not understandable enough to stop. Whether the fear came from real pursuers, a crisis of perception, or a fatal combination of both, the outcome was the same. He crossed from a monitored environment into the blind margins around it, and whatever happened next remained just far enough outside the frame to defeat certainty. That is what endures. A terminal chair. A bag left behind. A man standing up as if something has just become urgent enough to outrun. A door opening. Sunlight. The edge of the airport. A fence. Then no more. There is one more angle that serious analysis has to confront, even though it is emotionally difficult. Disappearance cases sometimes remain unresolved because the key question is asked in the wrong order. With Lars, the public keeps asking, who took him, or where did he go? Those are natural questions. But another may matter first. At what exact point did he stop experiencing the same reality as the people around him? If that point came before the airport, then the disappearance began long before the footage. It began in the hotel room, or on the phone, or in the aftermath of the fight, or in the isolation that followed his friends leaving. The footage would then be not the cause of the mystery, but the first public evidence that the mystery had already taken hold. This matters because it changes what the case means. It stops being only an airport vanishing and becomes a study in how invisible crisis can move through public space, undetected, until it turns into emergency. Airports are full of people performing stress while still appearing functional. Delayed passengers, injured travelers, frightened travelers, intoxicated travelers, exhausted travelers. Most still make their flights. One does not. Later, everyone searches the terminal for the missing answer, when the answer may have been forming quietly in all the minutes, before anyone realized this was not ordinary travel stress at all. It also explains why the footage feels both dramatic and incomplete. We are not seeing the beginning of his fear. We are seeing the overflow. There is also the possibility that the airport itself became symbolically contaminated for him. If he believed dangerous people were connected to the place, or if he feared being trapped there, then the terminal may have ceased to function as an exit in his mind. It may have become the place from which he had to flee. This is important because it helps explain one of the most counterintuitive features of the case. To outside observers, the airport equals rescue. To Lars, at least for those last seconds, it may have equaled exposure. Once that inversion occurs, the rest of the footage makes far more emotional sense, even if the source of the inversion remains unclear. Another overlooked issue is language. Travel strips people of their native ease. Even a capable tourist becomes smaller when forced to explain fear, pain, and urgency through uncertain translation. Medical nuance, personal threat, and emotional distress can all become distorted across languages. If Lars was trying to describe what had happened to him or what he feared, he may have been doing so imperfectly in an environment that expected quick, practical communication. That does not prove a misunderstanding at the airport doctor office, but it does make one easier to imagine. Fear translated badly can sound like confusion. Confusion translated badly can sound like paranoia. A person can be desperately specific in his own mind and maddeningly vague to everyone else. Then there is the matter of sleep. People underestimate what disrupted sleep can do to perception, especially after travel, alcohol, stress, pain, and isolation. Even without any dramatic psychiatric mechanism, sleep deprivation can sharpen threat perception, reduce judgment, and make every sound or coincidence feel more significant. A person alone in a hotel room after a frightening incident may not sleep much at all. The next morning, he may still move through airports and appointments while running on a narrowed and distorted capacity to evaluate risk. Again, this is not a complete theory. It is another ordinary pressure that may have helped create an extraordinary outcome. If the external threat theory is true in some meaningful way, there is still a painful nuance inside it. The men he feared may not have needed to actively pursue him all the way to the airport for the fear to dominate him there. Sometimes the lasting damage of an assault or threat is not continued pursuit, but the internalization of it. Once fear has entered the system, every unrelated stranger can begin to carry the original face. In that sense, a real threat can produce behavior that later looks indistinguishable from irrational panic. This is one reason the case resists tidy either or conclusions. Trauma and perception do not stay neatly separated. The same is true of physical pain. Ear injury affects more than hearing. It can alter balance, pressure sensation, and the simple feeling of being at home inside your own body. A person who feels physically wrong may also feel existentially exposed. Every movement through public space becomes harder. Every noise can feel sharp or skewed. Every delay becomes more exhausting. If Lars entered the airport already physically destabilized, then the doctor visit might have intensified his focus on the injury rather than relieving it. Being told that you are fit to fly when you still feel damaged can be reassuring to one person and intolerable to another. Being told you must wait longer can also be intolerable if you believe waiting means danger. Both possible outcomes contain stress. This is why the exact content of the airport medical interaction remains so important and so frustrating. It may have been the last ordinary chance for the story to return to the expected path. A reassurance might have sent him onto the plane. A misunderstanding might have deepened his panic. An unrelated interruption might have acted as trigger. Without a full, transparent record of that exchange, the case remains suspended over one of its most crucial moments. There is a broader lesson here about the limits of public evidence. Viewers often believe that if a case is famous enough, the real file must be almost open before them. In reality, the public usually sees only a small and uneven slice. CCTV excerpts, translated interviews, media summaries, family recollections, maybe a police statement. The rest is inference. The Lars Mittank case has suffered from that gap more than some others because the visible slice is so emotionally powerful that people mistake it for completeness. It is not complete. It is simply unforgettable. And perhaps that is why this case feels more modern than many older mysteries. It is not only unresolved, it is unresolved in the age of clips. It lives in repeatable seconds. People can revisit the last movement endlessly, which creates the false promise that repetition will reveal what first viewing missed. But most mysteries do not yield to repetition. They yield to context, and context is exactly what is thinnest here. If Lars died soon after leaving the airport, then the tragedy is one of speed. A final burst of fear transformed a return trip into a fatal vanishing in less than an hour. If he survived longer, whether on foot, in hiding, or after contact with others, then the tragedy becomes one of duration. Somewhere after the footage there were additional decisions, additional chances, additional losses that no camera preserved. Both possibilities are terrible in different ways. The first tells us how quickly a visible life can end. The second tells us how long a person can remain beyond help, even after being seen. Either way, the ending stays unresolved, because the case lost its center at the exact point where modern people expect systems to take over. Records, cameras, schedules, checks. None of them were enough. There is something else haunting in the bag he left behind. Luggage in airports usually symbolizes continuity. Whatever happens in transit, your belongings are meant to carry your life forward. Clothes, documents, devices. The small private architecture of return. Leaving the bag behind, whether consciously or in panic, means leaving behind the future shape of the journey. It is one of the clearest signs that whatever governed him in that moment was stronger than ordinary planning. The trip home became irrelevant compared with the need to move now. That single detail undermines almost every calm, strategic, long-game theory more effectively than internet debates ever do. It also leaves us with one of the most disturbing contrasts in the whole story. His possessions remained inside the system. He did not. The documents that proved his identity stayed where travel could understand them. The person himself crossed into a zone where identity no longer guaranteed traceability. It is an almost perfect metaphor for disappearance in the modern age. The world can keep your record and still lose your body. That is why the Lars Mittank case still feels unfinished in a uniquely modern way. There is enough evidence to preserve the outline and not enough to restore the life beyond it. We know the terminal, the run, the fence. We do not know the inner sequence that turned a return journey into flight, and we do not know what the world did with him after he left the frame. In a surveillance culture that believes everything important is recorded somewhere, that gap feels like an insult to reality itself. But reality does not owe us complete recordings. It only happens. And somewhere on a summer morning in Bulgaria, it happened fast enough that a young man who should have gone home instead entered one of the most enduring, unresolved disappearances of the digital era. If you have a theory about what happened to Lars Mittank, tell me in the comments. And if you want more real disappearances, unresolved cases, and dark documentary investigations told with evidence first, subscribe to Silent Echo and leave a like. Stay with me for the next investigation. To move deeper into the case, we have to give the search more weight than internet summaries usually do. Online retellings often leap from the airport footage to the grand unresolved question, as if the space in between were empty. It was not empty, it was full of the ordinary work that follows a disappearance. Calls, checks, interviews, local searches, border possibilities, hospitals, shelters, roads, nearby woods, possible witnesses. The problem is that all of that work began with a handicap. By the time any organized response truly understands that a person is missing, rather than merely delayed, the person is already living in a different timeline from the one being reconstructed. If Lars ran from the airport and then kept moving, the first hours mattered more than almost anything that came later. And first hours are always harder to reconstruct than people think. The footage gives one great illusion. It makes viewers believe they know the starting point exactly. But knowing the point where he exits the frame is not the same thing as knowing his route from there. He may have moved straight ahead for some time. He may have cut left or right quickly. He may have hidden almost immediately if he believed someone was watching. He may have doubled back by a route not covered by the footage people usually see. He may have tried to avoid open roads and instead chosen cover. Someone running in panic does not necessarily think in terms that later investigators can model well. He thinks in impulses, distance from threat, concealment, avoidance of eyes, avoidance of buildings, the next available gap. Searchers, on the other hand, work in grids, expectations, and practical assumptions. The distance between those two mental worlds can be fatal to a search. There is also the question of how people behave when they do not want to be found in the short term. This is not the same as wanting to disappear forever. It is possible that in the minutes after leaving the airport, Lars wanted concealment, not permanent vanishing. But concealment, once it begins under panic, can produce the same external result as a deliberate disappearance. He may have hidden from airport staff. He may have avoided anyone who tried to help. He may have interpreted search activity as evidence that the threat had widened. This is one of the hardest realities in cases involving fear. Rescue is built on trust. If trust collapses, rescue can begin to look like capture. Imagine the terrain outside the airport, not as a clean map, but as a sensory environment. Heat, bright light. The shock of leaving air-conditioned space, traffic noise at a distance, scrub and grass, and the rough texture of places not meant for pedestrian movement. The body already keyed into adrenaline. The injured ear perhaps creating imbalance or distortion. A person in that state is not reading the landscape the way a search planner does. He is reading it in terms of hiding places, escape routes, and lines of approach. That may explain why a later search of the broader area could still fail to reproduce the logic of his movement. Searchers see ground. The missing person sees threat. Another aspect that deserves more attention is the role of shame and masculine isolation in the days before the disappearance. This is more speculative than the airport footage. But it matters because it belongs to the psychology of the final phase. A young man injured on holiday after some kind of conflict may not communicate vulnerability clearly even to friends. He may minimize, delay, insist he can handle it. Men often do this with pain and fear, especially in group settings where social image still matters. By the time the group leaves and the situation becomes private, the person may already be in deeper trouble than anyone around him realized. That is not because the friends failed in some dramatic way. It is because ordinary social life is bad at identifying inner collapse when the outer shell still looks functional. So we should be careful with hindsight. It is easy to watch the case backward and decide the warning signs were obvious. The final call to his mother sounds like a red alert when heard after the airport footage. The hotel change sounds ominous. The delay in flying sounds dangerous. But inside the actual timeline, events likely felt less coherent. Young men get into fights on holiday. Travelers stay behind a day because of minor injuries. People say strange things when stressed. Families worry and then the traveler comes home. That is what usually happens. The Lars Mittank case is frightening, partly because it weaponizes that normality. Almost every piece of the lead-up can be imagined as survivable until all of them are stacked together. There is another question that should be asked more often. Why did the airport doctor visit seem to matter so much? Not only because it preceded the run, but because it was a kind of institutional checkpoint. A frightened person enters a small room with a medical professional. In theory, this should be one of the safer moments in the whole case. A doctor can notice distress, ask questions, slow things down. Yet something about that moment did not stabilize him. Either the doctor did not recognize how acute the fear was, or Lars masked it until the trigger point, or the trigger itself happened so suddenly that there was no time to intervene. This is not blame. It is an important reminder that institutions are often good at processing visible injury and less good at processing invisible panic when it appears inside an ordinary task. The footage also contains a small emotional violence that many viewers feel without naming. Lars runs from the route home, not just physically, but symbolically. Every airport is built as a funnel toward return. Signage tells you where to go. Staff guide you. Machines translate your identity into a boarding process. To run out of that funnel is to reject the only stable path available. It is a profound act of mistrust, whether he mistrusted the people around him, the airport, his own perception, or all three. The act itself shows that the world of organized return had failed for him before he crossed the fence. He may have been in the right place, geographically, and still unable to experience it as safe. People often ask whether there were signs before the trip or before the final day that Lars struggled with mental health. Publicly available information does not support a confident answer, and that absence is important. It does not prove that he had no vulnerability. It simply means the public should not fill the gap with convenient certainty. Many acute crises emerge without a widely documented history available to strangers. Many perceived threats are also real, even when others later frame the fear as irrational. The responsible approach is to treat the absence of a public history as exactly that, absence of public history, not proof of stability and not proof of hidden illness. The same restraint should apply to the alleged altercation during the holiday. Because it is one of the few external events before the disappearance, people elevate it into a master key. But the public record of the fight is thin and retold enough that details often arrive already dramatized. Was it severe? Who was involved? Were there direct threats? Afterward, did the same individuals remain in contact with him? Did he identify them clearly? How much was rumor among friends versus documented report? These are the kinds of questions that matter if one wants to build a criminal pursuit theory responsibly. The fact that the answers remain uncertain is not proof of a cover-up. It simply means the case is not as neatly documented as viewers wish. This leads to a broader truth about mystery storytelling. Cases become famous not only because of the underlying event, but because of the ratio between visible evidence and invisible explanation. In the Lars Mittank case, That ratio is nearly perfect for public obsession. You have just enough footage to create certainty that something dramatic happened, and nowhere near enough evidence to say what it meant. A total absence of evidence often fails to grip mass audiences because there is too little to hold on to. A fully solved case closes too cleanly. But one final clip, one unexplained sprint, one foreign airport, one frightened call home. That combination is almost engineered to keep people arguing forever. Yet argument should not replace analysis. If we take the strongest rational theories seriously, we also have to compare them against logistics. Suppose Lars did flee an actual threat tied to the holiday altercation. What then? For that theory to hold fully, the threatening parties either remained close enough to track him to the airport or had enough presence there to trigger his fear in a convincing way. That is not impossible, especially if the original conflict was more serious than public accounts reveal. But it raises questions. Why is there no stronger public trace of those people afterward? Why no clear reported witness of pursuit from the terminal? Why no broader criminal event linked to them later? The theory survives because fear appears targeted. It weakens because the external structure around that target remains hazy. Now take the acute crisis theory. Suppose Lars entered a state of panic, delusional belief, or severe cognitive distortion in the final day. That fits the increasing fear, the call to his mother, and the airport run. But then what? He still has to go somewhere. He still has to evade discovery. He still has to pass from living man in public view to no confirmed trace. Acute crisis explains the trigger better than the ending. Unless one assumes rapid death in hidden terrain or movement into some undocumented corridor of transport, there is still a missing bridge. This is the recurring pattern of the case. Every strong explanation illuminates one half and leaves the other in shadow. This is why the hybrid explanations feel more realistic, even if they are less satisfying. Perhaps the conflict was real enough to seed fear. Perhaps the injury and isolation magnified it. Perhaps the airport doctor visit triggered the final belief that danger was immediate. Perhaps the run placed him into a vulnerable situation where ordinary chance or opportunistic human behavior finished the story. A hybrid theory is harder to dramatize because it lacks a single villain, but reality often prefers mixed causes over elegant ones. There is also the matter of money and identity after the disappearance. In many voluntary disappearance cases, some practical signal appears sooner or later: financial use, document use, a traceable border crossing, contact under altered circumstances. In cases of death near the disappearance point, other forms of evidence tend to surface eventually: remains, clothing, a matched unknown body, an accident record. The Lars Mittank case seems to have sat awkwardly between those outcomes in public view, which is one reason speculation kept breathing. Viewers feel trapped between two incomplete logics, too dramatic for a simple routine disappearance, too unresolved for a straightforward death narrative, too impulsive for a planned escape, too visible for a perfect vanishing. And yet here we are. To understand the endurance of the case, you also have to understand how airports distort our sense of scale. Airports feel enormous when you are inside them, and very small when you imagine the outside world around them. But many airports sit inside transitional landscapes that are difficult to search cleanly. There may be access roads, drainage channels, vacant lots, fences, service buildings, embankments, wooded strips, fields, industrial edges, and nearby traffic corridors. A person can leave the polished logic of the terminal and enter these fragmented spaces almost instantly. Searchers then face a problem. The environment is not large enough to look hopeless, but not simple enough to be transparent. That middle ground breeds long mysteries. One of the more sobering possibilities is that Lars may have died close to the airport after all, but not in the way people imagine. Not a dramatic collapse in open sight. Something quieter. Exposure in hidden vegetation. Injury from a fall. secondary accident after running into an area of risk, collapse from panic or untreated physical factors in a place searchers did not reach soon enough or interpret correctly. The public often assumes that proximity to civilization protects against this. It does not always. The spaces most ignored by ordinary movement can become accidental graves precisely because nobody expects a person to choose them. And then there is the role of time itself. As years pass, evidence decays. Witness memory softens. Terrain changes. Construction alters edges. Internet narratives harden around the most shareable details. The chance of solving a case like this does not remain constant. It diminishes. That is why the early ambiguity of the Lars Mittank disappearance matters so much. If the first model was wrong in even one crucial way, the years after it only widened the gap. A body near the original route might become harder to find. A witness who saw a frightened man hitchhiking may never understand the significance. A brief encounter on a road may die with the driver, who never connected it to the famous clip online. The emotional center of the case, however, remains surprisingly small. A mother receives distressed calls from her son abroad. He is trying to come home. Then the world gets smaller and stranger instead of safer. The last image anyone widely recognizes is not of him reaching a plane, but fleeing from it. That reversal is what gives the case a personal sting beyond the theories. Parents know the feeling of wanting a child simply to get home. Friends know the assumption that a trip ends when the flight departs. Airports exist to close distance. In this story, the airport became the last place where distance could still grow. This also explains why the case resonates with people who do not usually follow disappearances. Many wilderness mysteries demand imagination because most viewers do not know what it feels like to be lost in a national park or alone in open water. Airports require no such stretch. Almost everyone understands their basic choreography. We know the boredom, the tension, the waiting, the relief of being near departure. To see someone break from that choreography so violently is immediately legible as wrong. The mystery borrows the familiarity of modern travel and then tears it open. There is a quieter line of thought, too. Was Lars trying, in some distorted way, to save himself by running? Not from death in the general sense, but from a particular moment he could not endure. If so, then the tragedy is not only that he vanished. It is that the action, which may have felt most necessary to him, became the point where the world lost the ability to help. This is one reason footage like this can be unbearable. It records the last visible act of self-preservation and lets history judge it only by its outcome. Theories built around trafficking or organized abduction have also circulated around the case, often because they provide a strong villain and match public fears about tourism and foreign vulnerability. But these theories usually stretch far beyond the available evidence. There is no strong public basis for treating the case as a proven trafficking event. Such claims often arise in disappearances with little closure because they explain absence in a dramatic way. But drama is not proof. A disciplined investigation has to return again and again to the same standard. What is actually supported? What is only possible? What is merely repeated because it sounds convincing in an online summary? If we apply that standard, the most grounded version of the case still looks like this. Lars was under significant strain before reaching the airport. His fear appeared real to him, regardless of cause. Something in the airport doctor phase triggered immediate flight. Once he left the controlled environment, the event moved into terrain and circumstance loose enough to defeat certainty. Every stronger claim beyond that has to borrow confidence from evidence it does not fully possess. This may sound less exciting than the internet version of the case. In fact, it is more frightening, because it suggests that a modern person can still cross from visibility into uncertainty with astonishing speed and without any grand plot at all. Not because the world is magical, but because human beings remain fragile under pressure, and our systems remain much less complete than they feel from the inside. It is also worth asking why the footage itself has become iconic, partly because it captures movement. Many last known images are static: a still photo, a car on a camera, a timestamp on a receipt. Here we have acceleration, the body deciding before the story catches up. This makes viewers feel that if they watch closely enough, they can detect the cause in his posture, or the exact frame where fear became certainty. But bodies are not subtitles. You cannot read motive off a sprint. All you can read is urgency, and urgency is not an answer. The final question that keeps echoing through the case is painfully simple. What did Lars think was happening? If someone truly frightened him at the airport, then his run is tragically rational inside the wrong circumstances. If no one did, then his run is tragically rational inside a mind overwhelmed by something invisible to others. In both versions, he is not acting absurdly to himself. That may be the hardest truth for viewers to absorb. The last visible decision probably made sense from where he stood. We are the ones locked outside it. When a mystery remains open long enough, people begin to prefer the version that flatters their worldview. Those who fear crime see a hunted man. Those who fear mental collapse see a psychological break. Those who fear surveillance see the camera as proof of institutional failure. Those who fear travel see a tourist swallowed by foreign uncertainty. The case can carry all of those readings because its final visible moment is so stripped of explanation. But a good documentary should not simply choose the most dramatic worldview. It should hold the tensions honestly. So here they are. There was an external incident before the disappearance, and it should not be dismissed. His behavior before the airport suggests genuine fear, and it should not be mocked. The public medical and behavioral details are too incomplete to support overconfident diagnosis. The footage does not look like a calm, planned escape. The lack of a confirmed body or later trace keeps accidental death, foul play, and continued movement all in play. The case is famous precisely because no single theory closes all of these gaps at once. What remains, then, is the enduring image of threshold failure. Lars did not vanish at the height of the holiday or in some remote back road, long after the danger should have been recognized. He vanished on the edge of departure, on the edge of return, on the edge of the system bringing him back to the people who already knew something was wrong. That is the emotional geometry of the story. He was closest to home when he became most unreachable. And perhaps that is why the case still feels unfinished in such a raw way. Many disappearances leave behind a landscape that seems to swallow people without witness. This one leaves behind a witness without enough landscape. A camera sees the break, and then the break outruns the camera. We are forced to stand forever in that gap, looking at a man who is still here for 1 second and gone from our understanding in the next. Whatever happened after Lars Mittank crossed that fence, the most haunting part may be that he carried the reason with him, not because it was supernatural or unknowable in principle, but because the final private reality that governed his actions never returned to the public world in a form that could settle the case. He may have been escaping real danger. He may have been escaping a danger only he could see. He may have been escaping both. The footage keeps all three possibilities alive and denies us the authority to close them. That is why the story remains heavier than a simple airport mystery. It is about the modern illusion that being seen means being safe. It is about how quickly injury, fear, and isolation can collapse a person's world. It is about how the spaces around ordinary life can still hide endings.